Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about negotiating for remote positions. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, when negotiating for a remote position, let's say France to Germany, do I base my expectation of the average French developer or average German developer? I'm assuming that this has to, yeah, it's posted on what about salary negotiation in software development, so I'm assuming that's a salary thing. So this is a very difficult thing to answer, and so I'm going to say that it usually depends on culture. So the problem with saying that you're like, if you work in say France and you want to have a remote position in Germany, the problem is that it's too one-dimensional to say that, well, then you should set your expectations on the German salary or the French salary, because it depends on the culture exchange and the dynamics between the people who are hiring the remote worker and sort of what they are accustomed to in the marketplace, because some countries have a very like a certain dynamic with other countries, like when you're talking about the open market. An example would be like, you may not know that, but a lot of the recruiters here in my region, for here in Sweden, they're actually coming from the UK, and so a lot of the Swedish the companies and the Swedish developers are being poached by the UK market, because they're sort of figured out that, hey, we can actually do business here as well, even though that's sort of infringing on like the market for the Swedish recruiters, etc., etc. And another example of this sort of phenomenon, which can be kind of interesting in a way, is that if, say, for the sake of argument, that you work in India. Now, India, as many of us know, is fairly famous for outsourcing, where a lot of companies in the West will outsource certain jobs to India because they're looking for very cheap labor. And there's tons of those sorts of outsourcing setups and firms in India. So even if you're really good, because I mean the Westerners have this really weird idea that, yeah, just because you're outsourcing for cheap money, that means that all the Indian developers, IT people, are bad, or like they're cheap because they're bad. That's not necessarily true. I work with a lot of people from India who are extremely talented, extremely good, but that is a culture thing. Like, there are people who are willing to do it for a lot less. So even if you are like the best superstar rockstar developer in India, you might actually find that it's difficult to sort of get paid a decent wage for those skills, not because you're bad, but because the culture expectation between your country and whatever the other country is the way it is, right? And it's actually funny, because some of the guys that I work with that come from India, they actually moved to Sweden, and then just because they're in Sweden, their salary goes up to the same level as any other person who's working in Sweden, because here, like, the culture, like the way that you do the hiring and the work culture around the hiring process and what you pay people is different. So when it comes to France and Germany, as an example, I can't really tell you, because it might be that, well, the German IT companies, when they outsource, they're sort of going to pay you the same sort of money that they expect in Germany. But in some cases, it might be that, oh, well, they actually have a lot of people from, say, France that either are more expensive or cheaper, depending on the way it works. Because, guys, in some cases, I work with companies who hire a lot of consultants from certain parts of the world, where like they sort of know that, yeah, the consultants here, they're going to be a lot more expensive, but they're usually quote unquote worth it, or things like that. So they have different sort of like talent expectations, but they're also willing to pay a higher price for those people. Not necessarily because all those people are, the developers in that region are super good, but that is the culture dynamic, if that makes sense. So what I usually say is that it's best to set your expectations on the region that you find yourself in. In other words, you should, of course, not, I mean, if you're gonna do remote work, it's usually for some reason. It doesn't really make sense for you to be paid less than what you could be paid in your own region, unless you're like, there are literally no jobs. So that would be a good baseline. But you should also make sure that you talk to a few companies, because this is where it gets a little bit funky. Just as I've said to you guys before, that the interviewing process can differ a lot from company to company, and in like one company you are like the rock star, and in one company you may not be so good. It's very difficult. It's a very diverse ecosystem of companies, and they do work in sometimes similar ways, but some things differ quite a lot. Salaries and how they think about remote work and like all these sorts of things is one of those areas. So you might find that you get paid less or like not that well in one company when you do remote work, and in another company they have a completely different work culture. And so it's good for you to get a little bit of a range and feel for different companies in the region that you're doing remote work. So yeah, so what I want you to take away from this is that when it comes to setting expectations for remote work, it's very difficult to say one or the other, because basically it really comes down to a very complex set of culture dynamics between the countries and the companies and so forth. Some really large companies, for example, if they're on the prowl for really cheap labor, well, then you can't really set an expectation on being paid as well as what they would pay the people who work in their region, because the culture there is that, hey, we want to, it may not be right. It might be that you are better than the people who are working in, say, the US or here in Sweden, etc., etc. But because the culture exchange is not set up in your favor, you might have to move there. But if you move there and all of a sudden you get into the hiring process through the same region or somewhere else, they might pay you a lot more. It's really tricky. I've seen this happen many times before. And so what I really urge you to do is to just start by saying that, the base expectation, which is usually fair, is that you sort of expect around the same sort of money that you would be paid in your own region. And then talk to a few companies, because in some cases they will actually pay you a lot more, because there's no culture thing here. They just look at you as yet another consultant or someone who's working remotely, right? And they have certain ways of paying and so forth, which can be like a really benefit. There is this term that you may have heard, like digital nomads or something like that, which is, I would say, a fairly sustainable and pretty cool way of living if that's your thing, where you can actually get paid, like you can be hired in one region where they pay you a fairly good price, and then move to a part of the world where the cost of living is fairly cheap, and you can live pretty well due to remote working circumstances and stuff like that. But make sure that you, as I said, you check around with a few companies, because it's really difficult to say definitively that one way is going to work and one way is not going to work, because the IT ecosystem and the way people do business in IT can vary quite a lot from company to company. Have a great day.